Russia says it will allow ships carrying food out of blockaded ports if sanctions are lifted.
The long-awaited final report by top UK civil servant Sue Gray detailing rule-breaking parties in and around Downing Street during the pandemic is published. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he takes full responsibility.
Plus, U.S. lawmakers call for action over shooting in Uvalde, Texas, as schools in the San Antonio area begin increasing security precautions.
Welcome again. Russia has called for the lifting of sanctions that were imposed over its invasion of Ukraine as part of a comprehensive approach aimed at averting a global food crisis. But the Kremlin's Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Rudenko says Russia is ready to provide a humanitarian corridor that would allow ships to sail fruit out of Ukraine if sanctions were lifted and Kyiv demined nearby waters.
Yesterday, the European Union accused Russia of using food supplies as a weapon with global repercussions. Earlier, the UK's Ministry of Defence said food prices worldwide would keep going up while the impasse continued.
Meanwhile, on the ground, Russian troops are currently trying to encircle the twin cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Ukraine says the Russian invasion is in the most active phase as Russia tries to capture the eastern Donbass region. Sweden, Finland and Turkey are holding talks to try to overcome Turkey's objections to the pair joining NATO. President Vladimir Putin has issued an order to simplify the procedure of handing Russian citizenship to residents of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions in Ukraine's south.
Indeed, Zaporizhia is still under Ukrainian control, but many surrounding areas are under Russian occupation. Here's more on the situation in this report.
According to Russia's defense ministry, the port of Mariupol, the Ukrainian city which was taken by Russian forces after a 3-month siege, is operating normally. Earlier on Wednesday, a news agency cited Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Rudenko as saying Russia is ready to provide a humanitarian corridor for vessels carrying food to leave Ukraine in return for the lifting of some sanctions. Rudenko was quoted as saying by another news agency, RIA, that Russia is in touch with the United Nations on the issue. Ukraine's Black Sea ports have been blocked since Russia sent thousands of troops into Ukraine on February 24th, and more than 20 million tons of grain are stuck in silos in the country. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of global wheat supplies, and the lack of significant grain exports from Ukraine ports is contributing to a growing global food crisis. As Russia intensified its attacks on cities in the Donbass, people remaining in the war-torn region are undecided on whether to evacuate to safer cities or not. On Sloviansk's central market, the remaining stall owners are as frightened as those who board the trains. Market vendor Alina says that her disability and her family obligations keep her from leaving. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address on Tuesday that the situation in Donbass was extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Germany says it will keep supporting Ukraine as long as they need it. The foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, speaking to reporters on the sidelines of the Council of the Baltic Sea States, warned against a movement of fatigue and said pressure on Russia needed to be kept up.
Obviously, the Russian president is not willing to stop bombing innocent civilians, and that is why we have to make sure that Ukraine can defend their territory, defend their citizens, and we keep supporting them as long as they need it. And therefore, we are doing everything that citizens of Ukraine can live in peace and security as every other European country. But what we in democracy have to guarantee that if this war will go on, and obviously, unfortunately, it will go on as long as we don't know, that we don't reach a moment of fatigue where everybody in Europe, in society is saying, well, now this has been months of war and maybe we can move to other topics, because we have to keep up the sanctions until this fundamental breach of fundamental law is not there anymore.
Meanwhile, European Central Bank Chief Christine Lagarde says Europe must flex its muscles during times of adversity in reference to Russia's war in Ukraine. Ms. Lagarde addressed an audience at the World Economic Forum in Davos on a panel that included the Taoiseach of Ireland, Dutch Prime Minister, and the President of the European Parliament.
Ukraine has been top on the agenda for the four-day meeting of global business leaders, which kicked off in earnest on Monday with a video addressed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The ECB chief says the war in Ukraine reveals Europe had underestimated its strength in numbers.
As often in Europe, united in diversity and rising in adversity. We are in that situation of adversity, and we need to flex our muscles. We do have collective incredible muscles. I'll give you a few areas where we actually do that a bit, and we can do more. In competition policies, yes, we do take action. Yes, we can actually affect companies that are doing things outside Europe, but will have an impact on the European territories. We can stop mergers that are taking place in other places if it is going to affect Europe. In trade, we represent a monumental market that can actually set terms and conditions in negotiations with others. In monetary policy, it so happens that those 19 countries, soon to be joined by 2 new members, you were asking about new members, Croatia, I cross fingers, should soon be joining the club, and Bulgaria is next online, so it will soon be 21 countries in one single club by one single currency standards. Well, this is the second international currency in the world. It doesn't have the exorbitant private privilege of the dollar, but it is the second international currency of the world. And when monetary policy decisions are made in Frankfurt,
now, Hungary's government will be announcing the first measures to respond more quickly to challenges created by the war in neighboring Ukraine. Hungary's re-elected president, Viktor Orban, who won a 4th consecutive term in an election on April 3rd, has used a special legal order in the past, once due to Europe's migration crisis and later during the COVID-19 pandemic. The new state of emergency similarly empowers Mr. Orban's government to approve measures by decree. In a Facebook video, he said, "The world is on the brink of an economic crisis," reiterating that Hungary must stay out of the war in Ukraine and protect families' financial security. Mr. Orban's government is having to deal with the consequences of the war in Ukraine, annual inflation of 9.5% and a budget deficit that ballooned in the first quarter due to a pre-election spending spree. It also needs to avoid a marked slowdown in the economy.
Let's come to Ukraine's economy now. When Ukrainians aren't talking about war, there's a fair chance that they are talking about petrol. For the past 3 weeks, the country has found itself in the midst of an acute fuel shortage, which means that all but a handful of pumps nationwide are closed to the public.
Well, since the war started, actually. Last week, the 550-kilometer road from Lviv to Kyiv had just 2 working petrol stations. Each had a queue tailing back several hundred meters. A station on the approach to the capital was also remarkable in being closed, but attended by more than 50 vehicles. A rumor had circulated that deliveries might be arriving in a few hours. Well, joining us now for more on this is Economist, Dr. Biodun Adedigbe. Dr. Adedigbe, thank you for joining us on the program this evening.
Yeah, and thank you so very much for having me.
Indeed, and I'm glad we can hear you. First of all, it seems the war has made life, well, it doesn't seem, it has made life impossible for Ukraine's energy planners. It's damaged critical infrastructure, it's broken many supply chains. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you so very much. Now, when this war started, I thought about the whole issue and came up with 5 critical questions about the war. The first question I asked is, where is the war taking place? Obviously, inside Ukraine territory. Second question is, what are those things or people that are suffering? And of course, it talks to lives being lost, of course, disruptions, and not only that, assets being destroyed. And we come to the third question, of infrastructure being destroyed, as you said, everything happening within Ukraine, then the next question I ask myself is, who are the beneficiaries of this war? Now, anywhere in the world that a war is being fought, the primary beneficiaries usually are in the defense industry, that is those who produce weapons. So either in terms of fresh supplies or the replacement of what is being used to prosecute the war, which means the economics of it is that primarily the beneficiaries are in those countries or locations where the weapons being used are being produced. And of course, ultimately, we now say, okay, let's look at it globally, how it affects the rest of us. So in my own estimation, by all means, it has caused disruptions to life within Ukraine and also the rest of the world. And so we are looking at the consequences, now compounding the challenges we faced with COVID-19 that we're just pulling out of in 2021. Yes, now the reality that we thought would begin to happen this year and next year is staring us in the face. Inflationary pressures all around the world, and then the growth that every economy achieved in 2021 as a result of the stimulus in response to COVID-19 impact on economies. Now, we expect the economies to slow down. Once they begin to slow down, and the inflationary pressures we are seeing now compounded by that war will lead us seeing most countries tumbling into stagflation to start with. That means stagnancy in terms of growth of the economy, and then you have inflationary pressures. Of course, you begin to see recessions and contractions of economic activities.
Well, so the problem really is that we're not on the ground in Ukraine to really know, the impact of, this war on the economy. But before the war began on February 24th, 80% of the country's fuel was being imported. Many of that came by rail from Belarus, which is now an enemy to Ukraine, and also participants in this war. A small part of that came by sea into Black Sea ports, which are now closed by the Russian naval blockade. What choices does Ukraine have now?
I will put that in this context. First is that you produce and supply locally only 20% of your refined petroleum products consumption. That means, in any way, you have to begin to ration. And rationing, of course, in economic terms means you want to set your priorities and then ask yourself, where should most of what you have available go to? Based on information available, that is already happening in Ukraine. And the primary consideration for refined petroleum products allocation is to the military. That one is already given in terms of information available there. Then, of course, the response to the rest of it will be to identify essentials, and that means essential economic activities. We also need to be set out and apart to receive also some percentage of that 20% space that they have remaining from local production. Then secondly, will be for those who need to move, they probably should now be thinking of giving priority as well to mass transit where necessary. And then ultimately, to also appeal to people to avoid fossil fuel-powered means of transportation, so that will also reduce the pressure in the domestic oil market. Those are the three things I believe they can do in the light of what we have seen them do so far, which is rationing and putting more attention to allocations to the military.
Would you also make such suggestions, especially for people who are in other parts of Ukraine? Because, we've seen Russian rockets destroying a dozen fuel storage facilities, railways restricting even agriculture. And we know that there are persons who are living in other parts of Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, that's really a major challenge. But in a war situation, the first thing we say is safety first. And that means even if you are able to continue to live your normal lifestyle, so to say, which means you are able still to engage in your normal economic activities, whether in agriculture or other spaces within the economy, it will still be with the underlying tension and fear that the war can escalate and get where you are. So everything you want to do will be with caution. So in that case, if you look around today, most commodity prices in such an environment will be driven not by today's rate of inflation, what you call the current inflation rate, but it will be driven mostly by expected inflation, which means it is not out of place to expect, in fact, based on what is observed currently, that prices are ticking up, which is normal in a situation like this where supply is hampered. So certainly prices are going up, but unfortunately, the strange thing that we're now crawling is expected inflation that will make those having supplies available begin to sell higher than they would ordinarily have done if the country weren't in a war situation, even in the areas where life is still having the semblance of normality.
Even in the war. And also, Dr. Adedikpe, we saw last night the EU announced, allowing for temporary trade liberalization, other trade concessions with regard to certain Ukrainian products. This means that for 1 year, import duties on all exports, Ukrainian exports to the EU will not be due. How far does this go to help the country?
Yeah, I will say that is a very good gesture. But when it comes to international trade, which is the key issue here, the first thing you have to do is to produce. And when you produce, after that kicks in logistics, what we describe as the issues involved in supply chains, especially from where it's produced locally to the point of dispatch to the global market, and then from there to get into the global market. So it means what you produce must walk through the supply chains and then get a passage to become export. So in which case, until it leaves Ukraine for the target market globally, it doesn't become an export. It still remains what is locally produced. So the real big issue I see here is logistics. And that means the benefits of this gesture from the European Union will only become fully expropriated by Ukraine when the disruptions to supply chains and logistics are resolved. And I don't see that coming to, a major benefit until the war is over.
Economist Dr. Biodun Adedikpe, BA Consult. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up on The World Today.